The 573rd edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
And that could make a difference. Lawson at the buzzer. Got it! Maybe not. Ty Lawson wins it at the buzzer.
Deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Gets the roll. Here we go. Page has it. Carolina down one. 84-83. Page into the front court with 4 seconds. Page to the rim. Got it! He got it! 9/10 of a second to go. Inbounds. Washington gets it to Warren. His full court shot. No good. Marcus Page baby. Does it for the Tar Heels. Carolina wins it.
Don't force it if you're Goss.
Comes in. Blocked by Meeks. Buried up ahead to Jackson. And he tucks it down for the 5-point lead. Matthews off the mark. And this year the confetti is going to fall for North Carolina. They're not going to be denied this time. Inside 30 overall. Love, top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome in to another live edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. Josh Anthony here with you on a Thursday night, the second installment of the What If series, our off-season project where we're looking at the biggest what ifs in Carolina basketball by decade. We did the 1950s a few weeks ago and had folks asking, what if they never come back and finish the series? But we're here tonight, and we'll be getting you knocked out of this series here over the next handful of weeks. And tonight's edition should be a lot of fun with an uneven decade for Carolina basketball in the 1960s, where Carolina would eventually establish themselves as a national power under Coach Smith. So we'll get to that in just a moment. We start every edition of the pod, as we always do, with the pod thought of the day. We go to Jeff Van Gundy for that pod thought, and that thought is, quote, the best teams play for each other, not with each other. And I think that's something that, Jeff Van Gundy's not a disciple of Dean Smith. He's not a Carolina basketball guy. But that quote, I think, really defines when this program is at its peak, kind of like it was at the back end of the 1960s. It became a program and a team and a family that played for one another as opposed to playing with one another. And, that's certainly a lot harder to do in the current climate of college basketball with the transfer portal, changing your roster year over year. You have the arrival of revenue sharing and NIL, which means that now everybody on the roster is getting paid, but they're not all getting paid equally. That could divide the locker room, and that's just another challenge that head coaches have to overcome. And we've talked about it kind of all offseason as we've seen this roster come together. This is going to have to be a team that has to rely on the whole of its parts because there's not a lot of star power. And if Carolina's going to be good in 2005, 2026, it'll be because they play for each other and not individually, or not in a cohesive manner.
Yeah, I think that certainly is what we expect from this year's squad, is because, we've talked about it. Who are the stars on this team? We don't necessarily know who exactly those guys are. We don't even know if one of the guys is going to be playing for the team that they went out and got this offseason. So, the hope is that this is a group that really buys in, that this is not really a group that's looking towards the next steps in their career. A guy like Caleb Wilson isn't necessarily looking to just get to the NBA. He's looking to, do something while he's at Carolina. And playing for each other, I think, that chemistry is something that's built in the offseason. That's something that's built during these times of year where the coaches might not be able to coach these guys, but these guys need to be out doing the things that they're doing. They need to be playing pickup games and everything like that. We heard back, a couple off seasons ago when Carolina struggled, not a couple, but a few off seasons ago back when Carolina struggled, they said, that guys just weren't doing necessarily what they needed to do. And so I think that's the important thing. And hopefully, that's not something that we'll have to hear about this team when it's all said and done and we're recapping this season. But I think this is the time of year where you really build up, the teams that play for each other and not with each other, where you build that camaraderie and learn about some of the guys on your roster. So that's the important thing for Carolina to do right now. They need a season where they are all bought into winning for each other, because this is, at this point, it's really about winning for Coach Davis, because there's a chance that if you don't win and do it at a high enough level, then he won't be the coach moving forward. So hopefully this is a group that's bought in on doing that heading into the season.
Yeah, and you mentioned, this is the time of year where you build that chemistry, that camaraderie. Kind of something that's kind of taken foot under Hubert is the annual beach trip. You see the program go on, and we've seen that beach trip has come and gone. We're starting to see, they've done some social media stuff with that, and it does appear to be a team that likes one another, that enjoys being around one another. Of course, no Luka Bogovic's on this trip. That's something they'll have to work in once they get him over here, get him cleared, which that's on the doorstep of being finalized, and that's in a really good spot for him to be a part of the team when practice opens up later in September. So, but that you're right, that stuff takes place now, and you see stuff where they're kind of forcing chemistry, but that's because you don't have the benefit of keeping a roster together for 2 to 3 years. Even if you have guys like Seth Trimble that have been in your program for 4 years, you're still bringing in, at least 3, 4, 5 new guys on any given year. This year, that number has ballooned up to 9. And so the quicker this team can gel off the court, the quicker they can gel on the court, which is ultimately the most important. Let's now dive into the 1960s what if portion of tonight's episode. And, an uneven decade, if you will, for Carolina and for Coach Smith. Of course, when the decade starts, you're dealing with the NCAA investigation that would eventually lead to the resignation of Frank McGuire, that would lead to the hiring of Dean Smith. And he got off to a relatively slow start, but by the end of the decade, he had put the program on the scene in a national way. And frankly, from that point forward, Carolina has not left the national scene in college basketball. But the first thing we got to talk about when we talk about the 1960s is the recruit. And that's by the man by the name of Art Heyman, who, of course, if you're familiar with the Carolina-Duke rivalry, if you're an ACC basketball honk, and if you're an old-timer, you know this name because he was one of the first great Duke players as Duke emerged as a national program in the 1960s. Yes, they do have history outside of Coach K. They don't embrace it, but it is a reality where they were a national program in the 1960s under Vic Bubas. And the big reason why was Art Heyman ultimately ended up played in Durham and not in Chapel Hill. Was supposed to play at Carolina, had all but committed to play for Frank McGuire, but the arrival of the NCAA investigation and then Frank's handling of Art Heyman's recruitment kind of led him to go play for the rival 8 miles down the road. And back in those days, freshmen weren't allowed to play on the varsity team, so freshman basketball was not only a thing, it was a big thing. And as basketball became more and more popular in the state of North Carolina, freshman basketball in the Triangle was a pretty big deal, to the point where during his freshman season, he got into a fight with some Carolina guys, and that would carry over into his first year as a varsity player when he got into a fight with Carolina guys, Larry Brown, Donnie Walsh. I think Doug Moe also got involved to the point where it wasn't just punching and swinging. There was some spitting going on. as well. And, if you've ever read the book Blue Blood by Art Chansky that details the rivalry, that was really when the rivalry really started to grab hold in the state. And that's really when the animosity between the two programs would kind of start what would become the greatest rivalry in all of college basketball. In our opinion, it's the greatest rivalry, not just in college sports, but in all of college, but in all of sports. And so, with this one incident kind of being the fire starter for what the rivalry would become, I guess the best way to ask this question is, what if Art Heyman would have done what he was supposed to do, which is play for Frank McGuire and play at North Carolina? Are we still confident? Is it still possible that because of proximity and what the two programs would do, does the Duke-UNC rivalry still emerge as the greatest rivalry we have in sports?
Yeah, I think it probably still does, because I think there's a fight probably the other way that ends up happening. Art Heyman, from everything that I've read about him, really seemed like an incredibly unpopular player, not only with his, with other teams, but his own teammates even looked at him as a guy that wasn't necessarily the greatest teammate, was a guy that was always looking to start with guys on the team. So I think there's a chance that it still ends up happening. It's just the other direction. And, the thing that's amazing is the reason that he didn't end up at Carolina, according to an article that was written earlier this year by Mark Mailer and Jeffrey Tabiri of the Assembly, was that there was a fight between Art Heyman's stepfather and Frank McGuire. Apparently, it took place at the Carolina Inn, and both guys apparently got in each other's faces, had to be separated. Apparently, it was something to the effect of he called Carolina a basketball factory, and for some reason Frank McGuire didn't like that. And they were basically face-to-face with each other, according to Art Heyman, I guess, was recounting that to one of the longtime Durham sports writers, Alf Featherson, a few years after it happened. So, I mean, this was a guy that, came from a family that was very boisterous, would constantly get into back and forths and everything like that. And then, I think him just being a guy that was, from the streets of New York and everything like that, he sort of carried himself around like he was the toughest SOB out there. And so I bet eventually something would have happened, because Duke would have recruited probably someone in his place that would have been pretty good. The Vic Bubas era was pretty successful there. And so who knows, maybe there's a fight between them. Ultimately, what probably does end up happening is if Coach K still ends up going there, that's when the rivalry eventually emerges. There would have been some moment between those two sides. They're way too close together. You would have had one of the most historic coaches in the history of the sport at the time in Dean Smith taking on the young guy in Mike Krzyzewski. We, of course, have, the complaining that Mike Krzyzewski did about Dean Smith during his time as a young coach. And I think eventually you would have seen that rivalry come together. But it is certainly one of those moments that's a hallmark of the rivalry and got it started a little bit earlier than maybe it would have been.
Yeah, I still think Duke Carolina becomes Duke Carolina, because as you mentioned, when Duke hired Coach K, he had the infamous double standard remark where he talked about how there was two set of rules in the ACC, a set of rules for Carolina and a set of rules for the other members of the conference. Very ironic how when that kind of got flipped around him when he built Duke into a national power, and people felt like there was now a double standard for Duke and everyone else, he would deflect that. But that kind of just shows you kind of the greatness that existed within him. And then the arrival, of course, of ESPN was able to really take the rivalry to another level. So I still think that it still becomes what it becomes. But this is a part of the rivalry that it's very rare that this incident gets talked about. Like whenever we watch the game every single day, twice a year, it's very, very rare that this gets brought up. And there's actual footage of the fight that does exist. I've seen it, and there have been different points in time when you do see it to me, I feel like this should be like the A-Rod fight with the Red Sox and the Yankees, that, whenever they try to promote that rivalry and you see him throwing Don Zimmer to the ground, I think this should be footage that should be a part of it, just as much as seeing, Bloody Montross, Bloody Hansborough, the Capel buzzer beater, because this is ultimately what started it all. Because at this point in time, yes, Duke was 8 miles away, but Carolina's primary rival was NC State. This really started to grow the animosity between the two programs. But, it was Carolina and NC State from the time that the ACC got formed in the early 1950s on through the 1960s into the 1970s. It's really not until the 1980s when it really transitioned into Carolina and Duke being the premier rivalry. So, but you're right. This is a hallmark incident. This is something that I think if you're a Carolina fan or if you're a Duke fan, you should know the backstory of this, because it's one of the early anecdotes and what we believe, what we cherish as the greatest rivalry in all of college basketball.
Yeah, I think it doesn't get talked about. And the other one that it reminds me of is Matt Doherty, Chris Collins. That's another one that doesn't really get talked about, where those two, especially this one, this is what kind of leads off the rivalry. This is what made people start to realize, okay, these two teams really do hate each other. I don't understand why it isn't shown more. I don't know if it's something that, is seen as just too over the top. But I do believe that it is something that you should have in some of those packages when you talk about the rivalry, because it's really the starting point for it. So it is interesting that they do seem to leave that out. But yeah, I would like to see that in there instead of seeing my players get beat up like Bloody Montross and Bloody Hansborough. That would be nice to see us, get in the middle of something like that. But, I don't know. I don't know if they're going to be showing it that often in the future.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. It's my hope. This is why I need to work these games and be in charge of the production of Duke Carolina, because I would make sure stuff like this gets talked about in the lead up and during the broadcast. Our second what if involves, Coach Smith, but it's not him being hired. We're not doing a what if about what if Carolina went in a different direction. And you're probably asking why. Isn't that a pretty logical thing to talk about? Quite frankly, it's not. Because he was such a factor in helping Carolina be responsible and responsive during the NCAA investigation. When Frank McGuire decided to resign and pursue a job in the NBA, there wasn't coaching searches weren't really a thing back then, and the chancellor didn't even feel like conducting one. He literally, when Coach Smith got hired, was not given a demand to win, was just told to not embarrass the program, because Carolina was embarrassed by what had happened. And so the what if does not involve about what if they would have went in a different direction upon his hiring. The what if with him comes in his first 4 years, where it wasn't the best of records. In his first 4 years, he was 50-36 overall. In 1961-62, his first year, he was 8-9. His second year, he improves to 15-6. His third year, the program regressed back to 12-12. In his fourth year, Carolina goes just 15-9. And of course, you have the story where they get back from a road loss where they got blown out by Wake Forest. They get back to Woolen Gymnasium, and they see Dean Smith being hung in an effigy outside of the arena in a tree. And it was the Kangaroo Kid goes, rips it down. And it wasn't even the next year. Carolina goes 16-11, but some people kind of view that as the turning point, because the players stood up for their young coach who was struggling. Of course, back then, social media not a thing. Sports writing wasn't even that big of a deal. So there wasn't pressure from the media for him to be fired. But this was a program that, less than a decade ago had won a national championship. Frank McGuire had, put it right there on the doorstep of being a national program, a premier program in the ACC. And this young up-and-coming coach that would go on to maybe become the greatest coach in the history of college basketball definitely did not get off to the best of starts. 4 years, 50-36. Of course, no NCAA tournament appearances, because back then you had to win the ACC tournament to just get in to the NCAA tournament. So the question here is what if Carolina had moved on from Coach Smith after going 50-36 across his first 4 seasons? Do you believe that Carolina would still become the Carolina we know and love today?
Yeah, I mean, I think eventually they probably do become one of the best programs in all of college basketball, but I don't know how long it takes to get there. I mean, look, they had already won a national championship, technically 2 if you want to give them the 24 title. But I mean, yeah, that national championship, I mean, it would have taken a little bit of time to find that next guy, because Dean Smith, I think, was a guy that had special ties to the university. And who knows if they're at that time where they're at, if they're able to hire a significant name or that significant of a name, especially because the NCAA stuff had just been resolved as far as we know it. So, I mean, yeah, who knows what the program actually looks like. I'm just glad that they didn't make that decision, that they decided to stick with a young coach and give him the opportunity to succeed here. Because when you look at it, he did have talent on some of those teams, but it wasn't nearly the talent that he would get as he would eventually start going along. And that was the thing. I think what they knew at the time was that it was going to take a little bit of time. They had went with a young guy that was on the coaching staff that nobody knew. And during that time, it wasn't the easiest thing. What you would imagine with an NCAA cloud hanging over the university, much more taxing back in that time than it was, when Carolina had the NCAA on campus under Roy Williams, because, I mean, it was just a completely different day and age. There wasn't nearly as much money that was going around and everything like that. So it was probably more difficult to recruit. It was probably more difficult to give consistent results on the court. And so for them to, say, hey, we know we've got a young coach here, we're going to end up sticking it out. It's what ultimately leads to Carolina being one of the most successful programs in the history of the NCAA, because, once he really got rolling, it was, Carolina was one of the most consistent teams in the entire country. I mean, you saw it, of course, the expansion of the NCAA tournament certainly helped him as well, but which would have eventually happened. But you would imagine that if Carolina is having to shift through coach after coach, then, who knows what actually ends up happening. It's so difficult again here to tell, because, we kind of did this when we talked about Frank McGuire, and if they didn't end up hiring Dean Smith as an assistant, that's really where we talked about if they didn't end up hiring Dean Smith. Who knows what kind of name they're able to attract? Is there really another big name out there that is willing to take over this job while it's under the NCAA cloud and everything like that? So I think you would ask the same question if they would have fired Dean Smith. Who takes that job after they just let go of a young coach who was dealing with a lot at that time? Are people really banging down the doors at Carolina to try to get into that coaching spot? And if they are they guys that are going to necessarily have the same type of success that Dean Smith eventually has? I don't know that ends up happening. Maybe this is still a great program, but who knows if they have the same number of national championships that they do with Dean Smith.
Yeah, I think it's not even just the national championship number, because Carolina doesn't have the most. It's the Final Four number where they do have the most, having gone to 21 Final Fours. You mentioned the NCAA investigation that he had to maneuver. And look, he was a young up-and-coming head coach compared to, like, Roy Williams was an established, Hall of Famer who, because when he took Kansas over, Kansas was under NCAA investigation. They had some stuff. So Roy kind of knew how to navigate that. For Dean Smith, the first year they only played 17 games because they could only play so many games. Like, their first game wasn't until December. And it impacted recruiting, where they were recruited where they could only recruit certain areas. And so it's why it did eventually take him time to establish himself as a head coach. And what's even crazy, and it's why I think, I wish we could maybe get back to the way you did it in the old days, where there wasn't the pressure to win. Because look at, 50-36, as I mentioned there a handful of times, his first 4 years, like that doesn't survive in the current climate of college basketball. Not making the NCAA tournament in each of your first 4 years does not, like, it doesn't matter if you're Carolina or if you're Wake, or unless you're like Wake Forest. Like most times programs are moving on if you can't make at least one tournament in 4 years. And the best example, just to tell you how different the expectation is and the demand is, we talk all about what Hubert Davis has done when he's reached the mountaintop, where he's made a Final Four, coached in a title game, won an ACC regular season title, has guided Carolina to a 1 seed. And the belief is that he is entering this year firmly on the hot seat. And so, like, there's no way that I would say in the tournament expansion era, which if you want to go back to 1985 when it went from 48 to 64 teams, like there's no way what Dean Smith did his first 4 years would survive at most major Division I programs that are serious about basketball winning. And it does kind of call into question, and we see it sometimes with coaches that get a job, they don't succeed, they get fired, they go back to the mid-major level, or they become assistant, but they get their second job, and then they really take off and have a whole lot of success. Like there is a point where you maybe wish, and maybe it's what Carolina's doing with Hubert Davis, where if you stick it out and endure some roller coaster years, some up and down years early on, you will achieve that sustained excellence later on down the road.
Yeah, the difference, I think, is that you do have the NCAA cloud that was hanging over Dean Smith at the time. I think with Hubert Davis, the immediate success put him in a spot where he put pressure on himself. Because he was that successful immediately, people thought, okay, this is what the expectation is supposed to be. It shifted. I mean, you go back and look at those teams that Dean Smith had. They had one NBA player on them that he was able to recruit in those first 4 years. That was Billy Cunningham. That was it. Nobody else. He had Larry Brown. That was a holdover. Larry Brown was a guy that was recruited to the university by Frank McGuire. So I think that was part of the reason back then that they even gave him more time, was because we just didn't have the talent on the court. I think for Carolina, you look at the 5 stars that they have landed, that's where the frustration lies with Hubert Davis. It's that, hey, we are bringing in the talent, but the development isn't necessarily there. I'll say it. I understand all the criticisms that Hubert Davis gets. And I think that they are all, for the most part, pretty valid that people bring to the table. I just think that sticking by him and allowing him another year with a GM, with a roster that should be able to compete because of the amount of money that they spent, I think is what should allow Carolina to have success under him. I think that's a smart move for them to say, let's bring in a GM, let's put a little more money into the program, and then we'll see what the results are. I mean, we've had multiple people that came up to us throughout the summer and have been talking to us about our opinions on that. And I think this is why this is a key year for Hubert Davis, is because if he doesn't succeed with this, you then ask yourself, how much longer can you possibly give him? I don't know. Maybe you give him one more year, maybe especially if he brings in a really talented recruiting class. You say, we'll give him one more year and let's see what he can do. Let's see if he can chase some really big fish in the transfer portal and then add to this group talent-wise with the guys at the high school level. But I just don't know how much longer you can wait it out. But the thing that's weird is that, you have the success of going to a national final in his first year. So it is a different resume for him. But it is, certainly a similar circumstance that Carolina's in right now, where there probably are a lot of people that want to move on from the head coach. But the powers that be are saying, hey, we're going to stick it out and see what ultimately ends up happening.
I think the most unfortunate thing about the first 4 years and the struggles that Carolina endured, outside of him being hung in an effigy outside of the arena, is the fact that most people kind of look over what Billy Cunningham did because it didn't translate into winning. And I thought that was one of the things about when Armando Bacot was chasing down some of his records. I think it really brought his name back into the fold of a guy that did all what he did in terms of double-doubles in 3 years because freshmen could not play. Like if he would have played 4 years at Carolina, because back then you didn't leave early to go to the NBA. Like as great as Armando Bacot was and is, he doesn't even touch those records. But a lot of people don't even really factor him in terms of the all-time greats because it didn't translate to a lot of winning. And that just simply isn't fair to the Kangaroo Kid who I think there's an argument to be made is a borderline top 10 Carolina basketball player of all time. At worst, he's going to be there somewhere in the top 15. We'll get to our last what if as we're doing our what ifs here on the 1960s. And we mentioned it was an uneven decade that started off slow, but ended in a big way. And that's because from 1967 to 1969, Carolina won 3 ACC tournament titles that got them a spot in the NCAA tournament. And they made the most out of them, going to 3 straight Final Fours as they arrived once again on the national scene. And from that moment forward, they would never leave it under Coach Smith, into Bill Guthridge, to Matt Doherty, Roy Williams, of course, now as we're sitting here with Hubert Davis. My what if when it comes to those 3 teams is they only played for the national championship once. That was in 1968. Of course, this is at the height of the UCLA dynasty where they won 10 titles in 12 years under John Wooden. They lose in 1968 to UCLA in blowout fashion. They lose 78-55. What if Carolina wins that national championship and you hold and but 1982 still happens, 1993 still happens, because now this elevates Coach Smith into that rare category of coaches that have won 3 national championships. I believe there are only 6 that have done so. And then look at the teams he would have been a part of taken down. You know, we know how good that Georgetown team was, an all-time Georgetown team in the 80s. He took down the Fab Five in the 90s. But I mean, UCLA, I mean, this is the premier dynasty in the sport, because we will never see what they did in the 60s and the 70s again. Of course, it was a different time, and you didn't have to win 6 straight elimination games to win a national championship. Nonetheless, 10 titles in 12 years is pretty doggone impressive. So what if Carolina wins the national title in 1968? I think, in my opinion, I think the conversation from Coach K to Dean Smith about who the greatest college basketball coach of all time, I think that shrinks because of the teams that Dean Smith would have dethroned. You have 3 national championships with all those Final Fours. I think if they win the title in 1968, there is a much more heated debate about him being the best college basketball coach in the history of the sport.
First thing I thought of, honestly, and there's a lot of different things that I think you can take away from what happens if they win the national championship. And I'll talk about some of those here in just a second. But I think you are 100% right. I think with another national title, first of all, if he gets that title, it really makes you wonder if some of the other ones down the line become a little bit easier for him to potentially get, because of the pressure that was on those players to get his first national championship, which they just couldn't seem to do. You wonder if maybe, the next year in 1969, if them going to the tournament semifinal, if they go further, maybe win back-to-back national championships. You go to another Final Four in 1972. Is that an area where they succeed? The big one would be 1977. Again, there was a lot of pressure on Carolina to win that national championship, to get Dean Smith his first national title because of all the success that he had up to that point. And, you just wonder in that situation with things a little bit different where Carolina already has Dean Smith's first title, do they get that second title right there? So I think there could be multiple national championships that could have been added to his resume. And then, yeah, we're talking about him as maybe the greatest coach in the history of the sport. Now, you could say that some people would probably push back and say, well, the guy that beat him in this national championship, maybe he was the one that was actually the greatest coach of all time. I think that was seen as an easier era to win national championships. Maybe you're having that same conversation about Dean Smith, but I don't really think so. I think the fact that it spanned across multiple eras, people would not be having that conversation. I think you're right. I think that he would be right there. To me, there would be absolutely no question that he would be probably ahead of Roy Williams as the greatest coach in the history of Carolina, where I think right now, we've talked about it on this podcast before, where we believe that it is debatable as to who the greatest coach in the program's history actually is. I think if he wins that title against John Wooden back then, even that title alone, beating John Wooden to get that title, I think probably puts him on the pedestal of the greatest coach in Carolina history, and right there in the conversation with Coach K as the greatest coach of all time.
Yeah, that was the other thing I thought about, was if they win that one in 68, now you have experience of competing and playing in a national championship game and winning. Do certain title games maybe go different? How does it impact recruiting? Now, Carolina still recruited at a high level, but if you have a national championship, maybe you get a player or two that really does put you over the top. And look, I never want to diminish what John Wooden did, because it's not what I'm about. You put those UCLA teams in a 64, 68 field tournament, they're not winning 10 titles in 12 years. Because we look at how many all-time great teams have not won championships in that model. So we can't prove that, but you can say that with confidence, because we've seen some great Carolina teams not be able to close the deal. We've seen great Duke teams, great Kansas teams, great Kentucky teams that entered the tournament as the bona fide best team in the country, but not be able to cut down the nets. And so I think it's why, whenever we do have the conversation, Wooden's name does come up, because when you've got 10 national titles, it's kind of hard to not play a factor. But it's why I think people, you go to Coach K first, maybe go to Bob Knight or Roy Williams. I think John Wooden's on the Mount Rushmore, but I don't think he is the best coach that the game has ever seen. I think if Dean Smith would have gotten that one, I think that would have put him kind of in that conversation, to where, as you said, there's a legitimate debate now on campus about who the best coach is between Dean Smith and Roy Williams. I've always leaned Roy Williams, because when he was supposed to win national championships, he did. He did more. He did so more often than not than Coach Smith did. I'm comfortable having that argument and that debate, because it's really a testament to just how great Carolina's program is, where you've got two so highly accomplished coaches where it's even a debate. But I'm with you. I think if he gets that one in 68, I think that tilts the scales back into his favor. And now you're having a 1A, 1B conversation. Nonetheless, you still have two coaches, I believe, that would be on the all-time college basketball coach Mount Rushmore, and there isn't another program that can say that, which again is the reason why I believe that Carolina is the best program in the sport, because not even Kansas and Kentucky, who have storied head coaches outside of Fog Allen or Adolph Rupp, I don't think they have two coaches that'll be on the Mount Rushmore of the sport. So these were the teams that set up the foundation for Carolina. It was Bobby Lewis and Larry Miller, the LMN boys, one of the best duos, not just in the history of Carolina, but in the history of the ACC. And from here on, man, as you'll see when we get to the 1970s, there was no looking back after these 3 years. 3 ACC championships, 3 trips to the Final Four. This is what I think really finally swung the needle in terms of Carolina becoming a basketball-first school. The 1957 was the beginning with the national championship. Basketball became a big deal in the state. but 3 straight Final Fours. Carolina would win the NIT in 1971, which was a big deal back then. Teams still turned down the NCAA to go to the NIT, but this was really what set everything in motion for Carolina basketball to become the powerhouse program that it is today. So that's our look at the 1960s, the biggest what-ifs of that decade for Carolina basketball. A little bit shorter in terms of just the what-ifs, but because, the kind of just the way that the decade went, with the way that the NCAA kind of played a role in there not being a legitimate coaching search, and then how the NCAA kind of, that investigation hindered the beginning to the Coach Smith era, kind of just a more concrete what ifs. I think when we get in the 1970s, there will be some bigger what ifs that we'll get to tackle, and we can't wait to do that here in the future. In the meantime, we'll direct you guys to the website. That's HeelToughBlog.com, where we are in full-blown preseason mode for the upcoming football season. ACC kickoff is behind us. We've gotten the preseason voting results out this week. We're just a little bit over a month away from the opener. Camp opens this weekend in Chapel Hill. Anthony's doing a great job getting you ready for the upcoming year with all the position previews. I think we turn our attention to the defensive side of the football next, with quarterback, running back, offensive line, wide receiver, tight end. All that's already been covered. We'll turn our attention to the defense as we continue to get you ready for the upcoming season. Carolina basketball side of things on the website, kind of just in a lull as prospects continue to set recruiting visits. We'll keep you covered on that front. We are awaiting the Luka Bogovac news to become official. When that does, we'll have you covered on the website. We still encourage you to go there every single day, whether it's in the morning, afternoon, or evening, the way to make sure you're getting the best coverage of Carolina basketball and Tar Heel football. As for the podcast, you guys know where to find us. Every major podcasting platform, simply search the Four Corners Podcast and we will pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any editions of the show throughout the remainder of the basketball off season. We have the What If series that'll take us through the rest of the off season, and we got some other stuff we're going to do as well. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. That way you don't miss any editions of the show throughout the remainder of the summer. With that is going to wrap up this edition of the show. I do want to thank Anthony once again for hosting. We want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.